We're live. And we are talking today about COVID and what's coming with a really great doctor who's in the thick of all this right now. Dr. Bhadelia will join us in just a moment. We have been talking about getting on top of COVID for a long time, but the White House has had a different view of things. Vaccine has been the word for a long time from President Trump, but we don't know when that's coming. And now the latest out of the White House is herd immunity. That means let so many people, hypothetically, let so many people get it that we become generally immune. But there is enormous skepticism about that, outright condemnation of that in many quarters. My guest today, Dr. Bhadelia is professor at the Boston University Medical School. She's director of the Special Pathogens Unit, an expert in infectious diseases. We're going to bring her in right now. Dr. Bhadelia has worked all over Africa fighting Ebola. Now she's in the United States and she is all over COVID-19. Hey, it's great to see you, Dr. Bhadelia. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Good morning, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Okay, I've got to get some more volume for you. Let me see. I don't know why I got that. 1 second. No. Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, okay. Oh, okay. Let me just pop these in and we'll be good to go. Hi, great to see you.
How are you? You as well.
I'm great.
It's been a few years.
Yeah, it has. Last time we talked, it was all about Ebola in Africa. And now here we are in the United States. And our issues are the biggest issues in the world when it comes to coronavirus. Yesterday, we had 65,000 new cases reported in this country. 65,000. That's about double what it was very recently.
That's right.
The most recent day I can see in China, where their population is 1.4 billion, 21 cases. Well, we have 65,000. Now you can say maybe they're not reporting everything, but even if they're missing some or undercounting a little bit, this is a vast difference. Can we just go straight to herd immunity? In this last week, we've seen something called the Great Barrington Declaration from a bunch of doctors, a group of doctors saying, let's let younger people under 65, I'm not sure what the age is, be out there, be active, live their lives, isolate those who are vulnerable, and let herd immunity kick in. You have called this nihilism. What do you think of it?
Yeah, I think you nailed it, or I suppose I did what I just said that previously. The concern is, the concept of herd immunity is generally not applied to natural infections. So we have never achieved that type of complete sterilizing immunity or ability to suppress a viral infection through just letting people get infections. In the past, when we've had viruses and we overwhelm when we've had no vaccines, they overwhelm the population and then they keep coming back. Generally, when we talk about herd immunity, the concept in modern medicine is used as you vaccinate enough people in a population so that even if there are people who haven't yet been vaccinated or haven't had the disease, that they're basically protected by the herd. The concern here is, I think the declaration that you mentioned, it's saying everybody nobody wants lockdowns. They're concerned that lockdowns have, and by lockdowns, I want to define what that means. It's really shutting down. I'm shutting down society the way we did in the spring, when we had all these cases that were popping up, when we had no sense yet of how widely community spread this disease was. And there are impacts to the lockdowns, but I think they sort of also seem to merge the concept of lockdown with just concepts of public health mitigation, things like masks and physical distancing and reducing the number of people in any one space, right? So what they're saying is that there's cost to the lockdowns, and Tom, I think the whole world agrees with that. This is a lesser. It was a lesser of two evils. The impact on our economy, the impact of being in house, and the psychological impact of that, the impact on ability for people to get healthcare, routine healthcare. The difference, though, is that their solution to that is simply saying, well, since this fire extinguisher didn't work, let's just burn the rest of the house down. That's really the concept. What they're trying to say is that we separate people who are vulnerable from people who are not in our society, which, by the way, 30% of Americans are considered vulnerable to severe disease, to COVID-19. Let's somehow artificially separate people in our families who are vulnerable and not, people in our workplaces who are vulnerable and not, even though we all share the same air. And somehow let everybody else who's younger, who may not be in the vulnerable group, just get this disease. So few issues with this. First is we don't know how long immunity lasts. So let's say
we don't have evidence that it really brings lasting immunity at all. It may only be weeks or a couple of months.
Right, and there's some nuances into that, why they, they're sort of making that stance, and I'm happy to go into where what we've seen is there's some, evidence from SARS and MERS, the other two large coronavirus epidemics that we had, that people tend to sometimes, there's evidence that there is lasting T cell memory. It's a different type of memory, but it doesn't translate potentially into protection. We don't know that for sure. We don't know that for this virus. And so you can't guarantee that you put society through that, and what are you putting society through? If you let the young get sick, CDC evidence now shows that generally illnesses in people over 65, they're usually preceded by outbreaks in the young. So the young are transmitting to the old. We can't separate our society. We need to shield the old. We need to shield the vulnerable. We should be doing a better job of it. By letting the virus, unfortunately, run rampant, though, what we're basically doing is potentially overwhelming the healthcare systems. They're already overwhelmed in parts of this country.
They'd be overwhelmed with young people who are sick, or with old people who get sick because the young are it's rampant among the young.
Yeah, well, some young are vulnerable, and they're vulnerable because they fit the medical categories that sort of put them at high risk. Some are at risk and we don't know why. We're discovering genetic basis potentially for why people may have more severe disease. The NIH had a wonderful study sort of looking at this recently. So we're just discovering, that even aside from those traditional risk factors, what it is that puts people at risk. And then even among the young, there are a percentage who get hospitalized, sick enough to get hospitalized, even if they don't die from it. And you guessed it, the brunt of that burden among the young is actually carried by minorities. Those who get much sicker, who need hospitalized, are overrepresented by African Americans and Latinx communities,
which is already
and Native Americans.
But so the picture, just paint the picture for us. I'm still trying to get my head around this. The idea of herd immunity, which the White House, you've got White House people endorsing this now, is that you would actually almost encourage the young to get COVID-19. It's like, go, live, do everything, get it, be sick, and then in the hope that they would gain immunity.
Which we don't know if they can get. Right?
We don't know that.
We don't know how lasting,
And by the young, what do we mean? Do we mean everyone under 65 or under what? What's the definition?
Well, they're very short on details, as they're short on how you separate families and separate workplaces.
But even before that, but never mind the separation. Just the idea itself is everybody under a certain age, you say go and live, party, go to the bars, do everything.
Exactly.
And it's almost encouragement to get COVID-19 so that you would hypothetically develop immunity.
So, but here's the problem, right? This is a brand new virus, and so all of us are vulnerable to it. None of us have immunity if we, if we haven't had it. If we've had it, chances are we at least have, for most of us, we have at least medium-term immunity from what it looks like, because we have seen reinfections, but we haven't seen it in that many people. But we don't know how long that lasts. In SARS and MERS, the antibodies started waning about a year or two down the road, and it's unclear if the immunity can last beyond that. So if we're all vulnerable, right, and there's 329 million people. And of that, 8 million currently we know got the infection. And let's say, that's 10 times higher. Somehow those other people weren't diagnosed, and it's 80 million. You're still looking at like 250 million people who are vulnerable in this country. And if you let the infection run rampant, you're talking about millions of deaths. And that's really the concern. And that's just deaths. We're not even talking about hospitalizations, right?
And deaths because you're saying there's no way to isolate the vulnerable, that is older people and people who have risk factors. There's no way to effectively isolate them. And by the way, we're looking at your Special Pathogens Unit behind you, where you isolate pathogens. So you know about isolation. But you can't isolate all those people if you've got tens and tens and tens of millions, of hundreds of millions even, who are infected with COVID.
Right, because what they're saying is shield the vulnerable, and in their image, it implies that there's this nursing homes, and those who are sick, and we should do that regardless. We haven't done a good enough job of ensuring, we have great testing and a lot of personal protective equipment for not just people who are vulnerable, but also people who work around them, in nursing homes and things like that, and healthcare workers. So that's not the issue. Everybody agrees with that. I think what the fault, sort of the fault line in their argument is basically, if you let everybody get sick, it will seep into the vulnerable and it would overwhelm us. It would get us back to exactly where we were in February. It would actually bring the lockdowns about sooner. And so instead, what we need to do is actually keep community transmission down. That's exactly how other countries have successfully controlled this, by simple things like, no one wants a lockdown. I do not want lockdowns. What we want to do is we want to, yeah, but it is the last resort of a healthcare system that's overwhelmed, that has no capacity to take on more from this exponential disease. And so what we think we should majority, the vast number of public health experts, of healthcare workers who have been on the front lines, say that the best way to do this is for us to live in this band of normality, right? It's to use the mask, simple things like using the mask, keeping in smaller groups, keeping that physical distance, improving ventilation. And we do that, we can actually get to almost normal. We can drive those numbers down and get almost normal, not exactly
even without a vaccine, you're saying, even before a vaccine.
Yeah, I think if we drive those numbers down, and you see that from modeling numbers from the Institute of Health Metrics at the University of Washington, they talk about the impact of just wearing a mask. Now, add to that, if you think about this as a Swiss cheese model, you have hand hygiene, you have distancing, the masking, the ventilation, the crowd control. You could drive numbers down if you consistently had people do that.
Swiss cheese, that is, it's full of holes, but if you get enough layers, the holes don't line up and something is going to stop it before it gets you.
That's right. And so you could do so much with that. You can't go back exactly to normal how things were, but you could do so much more with that until we get a vaccine, which, by the way, 4 candidates, advanced candidates for vaccines, currently in trials, and the results are expected as early as December.
So why, if that would work, why isn't it working so far in this country? Are we 65,000 new cases just in the last day? Are we that bad at the very simple steps of masking and social distancing that could slow this thing down?
We are. I mean, only 50% or less of us are actually wearing a mask. And I think part of it is also that we've been, there's been a lot of confusion created sometimes at the top even of our administration. So the Council for Foreign Affairs had a wonderful independent task force report out on the global response to this pandemic. And when it came to the US response, they said, there were some really big early failures that everybody sort of knows about. The testing was delayed. We didn't realize this disease was transmitting in our communities as early January, and we were still looking at only travelers into February and March.
Come on.
Yeah, we were very behind, right? And that's why we had to have those lockdowns, is to sort of drive the numbers down, because by the time we realized what was happening, it was already pretty rampant in this country. But since then, every step, we've sort of just compounded mistakes, and a huge part of that is misinformation and confusion, and downplaying of the severity of this virus. And they particularly actually even point out this administration, President Trump in particular, as confusing people about what's the steps that are needed. In the
town hall debate this week, or not debate, just town hall, he said that people who wear masks get COVID from wearing masks, 85%. I think that's what he said.
Yeah, no, he said 85% wear masks, which of course that's not accurate. The numbers are much lower than that. But right, it's exactly this misinformation, right? You can't, masks is, this is common sense. It's a physical barrier, and how good a physical barrier it is depends on the quality of the mask. And that's why N95 masks tend to be a lot better, and of course the difficulty with that is that there aren't enough N95 masks, because we haven't put as much sort of manufacturing power into getting that to where that needs to be in this country. But beyond that, even the double or triple layer masks, the data now shows that, you know, the surgical mask can decrease up to 60% of the viruses that you get, which is important because maybe that means you don't get the infection, because if the virus around you, there's not as much virus around you, or if you get it, the theory is that if you get a lower dose of the virus, you know, this is what we've seen from other viruses, the lower dose of virus that you get, chances are that that decreases the severity of the disease you get as well.
There's so many things I want to ask you. Let's just stick with herd immunity for another minute, though. They say that 9,000 scientists globally have signed on to this declaration calling for a push for herd immunity. Who's pushing this, and why? And why? Now, they've already found that they've got bogus names among that 9,000. So maybe it's not really 9,000, but some number of doctors, I guess, have signed on in support of this. Two different questions. I mean, first of all, who's pushing for herd immunity? What's the motivation, as far as you know? And then why would other doctors sign on to this if it's so dangerous, if it's the path of nihilism, of kind of a surrender?
Yeah, I think at the political level, so I'll talk about, you know, so I think the reason it's sort of, I think people need to know that there's even though you're hearing about the thousands of the signatures, you're talking about millions of others who are likely to sort of support the stance that we really shouldn't be pursuing this, including Dr. Fauci, who just called this a ridiculous approach yesterday, I believe, you know. And so it's, you really have to look at the percentages in terms of, this is sort of like the climate change debate. Right. There's the climate change debate where majority, you know, over 95, you know, percent of people sort of believe the science behind it. And then you'll always have a few people. But I do think it's sort of, you know, it's struck a chord with people, regular people, because this has been painful. You know, lockdowns were painful. This pandemic is painful. And Tom, you and I talked about, you know, the epidemic in West Africa and how it just devastated the communities there, not just directly. Ebola did, Ebola virus disease in West Africa, you know, affected sort of the economies, the health of the people there. You know, there were quarantines and ways to sort of keep the virus from expanding into other communities, but it had all these other undue sort of consequences. So pandemics have their toll. They have this psychological toll. They have this economic toll. You know, that's why they are tragedies. You know, and when people see this, there are a lot of people who have lost their jobs. There are a lot of people who have not been able to get their health care, right? And part of this is putting into sort of the reference of it is the pandemic that's driving this. Right, it's the public health measures that are necessary because of the pandemic. It is not something brought about by public health experts or doctors or nurses.
Right.
That's, I think, sometimes how the narrative sort of gets mixed. So this Great Barrington Declaration, I then want to talk about our sort of effort on this, sponsored by a libertarian think tank. And it gets this money from ExxonMobil, the Koch brothers, and the person who, one of the main authors of it, works with Scott Atlas. Of course, Scott Atlas is the one of the
advisor to Donald Trump.
Exactly, and so that's sort of the political background to it. But I do think that it's sort of, you know, what it's doing is tapping into this impact that, you know, that just the pandemic has had, without, and then misleading people into this other part of making them think that this is all because of public health measures. Because what happens? Why were lockdowns necessary? Because public health response failed. We didn't pick up that disease. The minute it landed on this country, we weren't good enough in trapping it down, right?
Well, there was active denial. There was active denial and resistance.
Right.
Hang on a second, though. You paint a picture of herd immunity, if we went for that, where you've got, I don't know, millions and millions of people, many more millions with COVID-19. Now, a lot of them are young, but many of those would have severe consequences. We don't know what the long-term consequences would be. People who were vulnerable, almost a third of the population would be terrified of the rest of the population because it would be seething with COVID. It would be full of COVID. I don't know who's going to deliver that takeout food to your door, or who's going to, I mean,
who's going to take care of you in the hospital?
Right,
all
because
the healthcare workers are younger.
But the people proposing this, they kind of know that. They don't think that it's painless getting to herd, and they're okay with that. So what kind of view of the world is this? Or is this, I mean, you saw in Africa when there was Ebola all over the place, do countries go crazy after a while under the pressure of rampant or very menacing pandemic.
No, not at this level. Yes, there is always exhaustion, right? But nobody, I think this is why I called it nihilism, because what it's basically doing is saying that we have to accept a certain number of deaths. And the question I asked back is this is an interesting timing for you to sort of recommend that we now just let this infection kill a bunch of people when the vaccine could be just around the corner.
Well, so what do you make of that? What is behind, is some kind of,
well,
you know,
what is the
Dr.
big event?
Evil, or what's going on?
What's the big event that's happening between now and December when we're supposed to get the first results from the vaccine trials? You know,
Well,
I am,
of course, it's a presidential election, but is that I'm going to let millions of you die? That's not a campaign platform.
Well, I also think it's in some ways an abdication of responsibility, because if you get to say, well, you know, this is the right plan, do nothing is the right plan, then you can say, well, we were right along.
Party hardy.
Do anything, right? And so I think that the Trump administration at all times in this, you know, despite having, there are some positive lights to the response. You know, one of them is Operational Warp Speed. There's
on the vaccine effort.
On the vaccine and therapeutics, you know, and this was something that was put together by the Health and Human Services, HHS agency, as well as the Department of Defense. And what the effort is just saying, let's find all these promising vaccines and therapeutics. And because companies may not take that risk in the money, because there might not be as much appeal and commercial appeal, the government would put that interest in, and they would carry that risk in terms of financial risk, I mean, and push them through trials and buy the first doses, so sunken cost, regardless of whether or not it works or not. And that's been great because it's really accelerated, you know, the evaluation of the therapeutics and vaccines. The trouble then is then you have the president coming out and then touting one thing after another that doesn't yet have efficacy, and that actually works against getting this products out, because if you hear something is in a trial and someone tells you that's the cure,
all the way back to hydroxychloroquine and all that nonsense.
Exactly. You will not want to be part of a trial. And if you can't complete a trial, society can't decide if this is efficacious and whether it's something that we should be manufacturing at high doses. You know, you can't get that same kind of efficacy data outside of a trial. And so the fact that, you know, there's been abdication of responsibility in my mind from the beginning, you know, in terms of the federal government just taking their foot off the
accelerator on dealing with it.
Right. And just saying the states figure it out. And so there was this like choose your own adventure, you know, disaster debacle across the country, where every state interpreted or didn't follow the White House guidelines for reopening. You know, some opened without meeting, you know, those initial guidelines for reopening. Some allowed businesses and other things sort of to be open at full levels despite increasing cases. And so you not only that, but like, you know, when you and I talked, I went back to listen to the West Africa and about Ebola conversation that we had. You know, one of the things that I think years
ago when Ebola was raging.
Yes, and one of the things that you and I talked about is it's so difficult with infectious diseases outbreaks because the epicenters, it's not like an earthquake. When you have an earthquake, you know, you set up your coordination, your medical care, your security in one place. With infectious diseases outbreaks, I mean, they start popping up multiple places. You have to keep cutting those resources over and over and over again, thinner and thinner, to try to get to all those places, right? You need coordination. And which body does national coordination?
We have a federal government. Good luck. It should be doing that, but it hasn't. Instead, it seems what you're saying is almost at every moment the Trump administration has either wanted to simply deny it or has looked for a way to appease public sentiment or calm people down or make it look like they were tackling this for purely political reasons. So that November 3rd date, in a way, has driven everything rather than life, rather than health, rather than logic and rationality that might get us to a better place.
A big percentage of it than one would imagine. That and I don't take my word for it. The best thing you could do is read the story from ProPublica yesterday of the impact of the White House on the CDC, on the silencing of the CDC. Really, from the very beginning of this pandemic in this country, it is heartbreaking to read that. It is for someone who's, you know, been in public health for decades now. It is to see sort of CDC, who's a beacon, you know, for public health leadership
of integrity,
not just here, but internationally.
Globally, globally.
And Right, and we've actually, U.S. has just like left the global health stage completely. You know, we got left the WHO. You know, are not part of all the efforts that are being put together to ensure that we get vaccinations and treatments everywhere, because it's in our best interest that the rest of the world is immunized so the
Yeah,
disease doesn't keep circulating
yeah.
around the globe.
And so people aren't just stuck in their own country, afraid to travel, come here, go there. So
Right.
you've said, though, no matter who wins on November 3rd, brace yourselves, people, that this winter is going to require a lot of resilience. Now, we're now approaching 215,000, 220,000 deaths. Where could that go this winter and in the year ahead?
So the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation actually had sort of talked about the fact that by January you might see doubling of the number of deaths that we've had. You know, so it'd be around 400,000. The CDC now says that we're at least going to be at 240,000 by November 3rd or 4th, or you know, the first week in November. Here's what's different about this increase that we're seeing compared to the prior ones.
Mm-hmm.
The prior increases, the peak in the Northeast in the spring, the one in the South, and you know, in the West in the summer, those tended to be more geographically located. You know, it's this concept of having one hot spot. You know, there were some
Right.
increases in
It was
other
New
places.
York, it was New England, it was here and there. Now it's the
Right.
upper Midwest.
Right, and it is the upper Midwest, but it's actually also becoming a nationalized pandemic, because you're seeing both increases in cases in 40 states, but also hospitalizations are very geographically distributed. You know, so
Okay.
there is definitely a hotspot in, you know, Wisconsin and Iowa, and those places are pretty hard hit. I think Wisconsin saw like tripling of their hospitalization rates over the last couple of weeks. And so the trouble
Wait, but
with
you're
this is
saying
that
we're all going to have it at once? It's going to be raging everywhere all the time?
that's the concern. The concern why that's true is because you're seeing cases and hospitalizations increase everywhere,
Yeah.
and not only that, but the factors that are potentially leading to the increases on those cases are, you know, cold weather. We think, you know, generally we think coronaviruses are much better at transmitting in colder weather, you know, and so
Why is that? Because the air is dry, they can float longer, you don't have humidity dragging this thing down to the ground, and why is that?
Right. And just, you know, the way that the temperature itself affects the viability of the virus, but also we're moving indoors, right? We're sort of the presence of the sun and, you know, ability of the virus to sort of survive with, you know, UV, all those other aspects. But the other part is we're all moving indoors because of the cold weather, and so we're closer together in the indoor space. And the studies show that this virus is, you know, is 20 times more likely to transmit. 20 times more likely to transmit this virus in the indoor setting than the outdoor setting.
Are we going to hit 1 million deaths at some point here?
So that's the concern. If you let the virus just rip through the, you know, rip through the population, I really do hope that that's not what we face.
But what's going to
think
stop
that,
it? Is it masks are going to stop it, or vaccine is going to stop it? If we're not going to hit 1 million, what's the roadblock?
yeah, it's going to be a combination. To be honest, it's never one thing, you know, Tom. Like there's so many diseases that we have vaccines for that we still see outbreaks. Measles is a perfect example, because you need to have vaccine and then acceptance of the vaccine and then distribution and enough people taking it for us to build that immunity. And that's going to take, you know, at least until, from what we've heard from Dr. Robert Redfield, CDC, from Dr. Fauci, really until next summer or next fall. And so until then, we still have to wear these masks. We still have to keep that physical distance. It's all of those measures together.
But the trajectory that we're on right now with our current behavior, and when it's not winter yet, is already seeing, as you say, significant rises in many, many parts of the country now. So
That's right.
That road to 1 million, it looks to me like we're potentially on it. And I don't see a vaccine kicking in widely enough, soon enough, as you say, maybe next summer or next fall before it really begins to have effect. So what would it take to get us off of this path right now of, I don't know, you're talking about maybe 400,000 by the end of the year or January, and we've still got many months of cold after that. I mean, do you see this country really hitting the brakes, even if we have a change of administration? What's going to change this trajectory?
Well, there's a couple of things. You know, I do hope that once the chaos of the election is behind us, and there's, part of what I meant about this couple of months after the election is not just the cases, but I think there will be a lot of political, chaos as well. And so
Yeah.
hopefully once that's behind us, there'll be a unified message and hopefully a bit more of an uptake of that message of what's needed to battle this epidemic. I hope that what that means, if there's a change in administration, what I hope it means is that public health experts at the CDC are a lot more vocal. Wouldn't it be great to hear from Ann Sukat, who's like, a world expert, or Dr. Messinier, who I just heard on an AMA webinar talking about allocation and distribution of the vaccines. Wouldn't it be great if you every day had a public health expert from CDC talking about the nuances, right? Though that's part of what I hope makes a difference when the political chaos goes away, is that we start focusing on the science and the public health, and there's a lot more direct conversation between our national public health leaders and the American public. The second is there might be some changes coming in advances, I hope, in medical treatment. And one of them is monoclonal antibodies. So that is the Regeneron antibody that the president got. Again, we haven't finished the trial, so we don't actually know how efficacious they will be. Once we finish the trials, I think a lot of educated guesses are that they might help reduce mortality. They may have reduced death rate. And so if you're hospitalized, and the other way that these studies are sort of examining them is when they're hospitalized, for patients who are outpatient, if they've just been exposed, if they get this, could it keep them from becoming sicker or not get them to the hospital to the hospital in the first place? If those
let me ask you about the monoclonal antibodies. Those are very interesting. President Trump got these. I'm told that, we read that he got like $1 million+ worth of monoclonal antibodies. Not everybody is going to get $1 million treatment in the hospital. And he's talking now saying, hey, maybe I'm immune. But people are saying, well, maybe you are a bit immune at the moment because the monoclonal antibodies are still in your system, but the effect of those does not last forever. And when that wears off, you may not, actually, they may have kept you from developing your own internal immunity, your own immunity. And you may be fully vulnerable again right away. So is monoclonal antibody going to help us if it costs that much and all it does is give you a kind of a temporary immunity while its effect lasts, and when that's gone, boom, you're vulnerable again?
Well, the second half of it is something that we've sort of academically discussed, certainly in the acute setting. So we should step back and just explain to folks what these are. So monoclonal antibodies that were particular, there's different types of monoclonal antibodies. Basically, monoclonal antibody means a clone of a successful antibody, right? That's why they're called that. And so monoclonal antibodies that we're talking about are those that have been identified in survivors as being very effective in neutralizing the virus. And then they take them into the lab and they clone them. And that's what they give to a patient who's sick, because in some cases, patients do not mount as high an antibody response as they should for them to be able to battle this virus. And these monoclonal antibodies become your soldiers. Yeah, exactly. And so they're successful because they're very much targeted as opposed to natural antibodies, which you just create millions of different kinds, and some are successful and some aren't, right? That's natural infection. These are really, they zoom onto the virus. Exactly. But the trouble is, as you said, Tom, there's a couple of parts of this. One is that, at least in the setting of the president, when they measured his antibodies, they probably picked up the antibodies that he received and not the ones that he developed, if he developed. And there's always been a question of whether that suppresses your body's ability to then create antibodies. I think probably on the longer term, you do end up developing those antibodies. It just may delay them, or it might change sort of the dynamics of it. But the more difficult part is the first part that you said, because these are expensive, and President Trump has said we'll make it available to everybody. And I hope that's true, because I think distributive justice, the idea that there's a resource and we can equitably distribute it to everybody in the middle of a pandemic, is so important, because not just for the individual, but because we want the disease to not keep propagating, right? But
Trump's
they're
critics
also
all came out and said, well, this comes from aborted fetuses. That's the source material for monoclonal antibodies. Is that true?
It's not from stem cells. It's from fetal generated tissue. So yes, and a lot of medical research then and discoveries that we found, the basis of them, do some percentage of that does come from that. But I think the important part
is that a restricting factor on the amount of this drug that would be available?
So
Or
no,
once
I
you
think
have it's off on its own.
that's just the research, right? We're just talking about the research.
Okay.
It's not continuously produced
It's
from
not
that.
like you
No,
need an endless flow of fetal material.
Oh goodness, no.
Okay, I mean, I think
just
it's
the
important to
medical
clarify
research.
that because
Yeah.
the critics are like, oh boy. But still, it's important to
It's the
understand that
manufacturing,
played
yeah.
a life-saving role, it
did.
may, in the development of this treatment, this therapy. Okay, just to clarify that.
Right, but I think the manufacturing itself is a lot more difficult than other drugs. You know, it takes longer to sort of create these, and the amount that you create could be sort of lower than what we need right now. I think they said there's 50,000 doses, and you said we have more than 60,000 cases a day, so it's not going to get around.
Yeah.
Right, and so it's not going to get around to where it needs to be, and so the concentration needs to be focused on those who are high risk, right? And people who are particularly vulnerable to having a more severe disease is where I see potentially that going down. So it would drive the mortality in those cases down. But that's just one bit, right? None of these things are silver bullets. It is a combination of us continuing to what we do, you know, getting vaccinated when there is a safe and efficacious vaccine, and having those advanced therapeutics treatment that allows us to take care of patients if they do end up getting sick.
The other part, and I mean, it always goes back to our behavior, to masking, to social distancing. I just saw somewhere public health authorities saying that small gatherings, never mind big Daytona Beach gatherings, but small gatherings were now a significant source of spread of COVID-19. What does that mean? The holidays are coming up. I've just been, working out with relatives who are near enough by, never mind big time travel to be with the big family, but we just have sort of provisionally put together a tiny little Thanksgiving of 6 of us. But people are going to be driving, 100 miles for that from different settings. I'm sure what we have in mind is that some of us can get tested, others will quarantine in advance. But I'm sure what people have in mind is sitting around a dining room table, 6 of us, for a couple of hours at least, if not hours, talking, eating, drinking. Is that nuts? Is that a crazy thing to do for Thanksgiving?
I think one thing, Tom, that I've realized throughout this pandemic is that people have to make their own decision, right? I mean, it's insane to say I'm going to go into a room with like 60 people and none of us are going to be in a mask and, there's no ventilation. For the smaller groups, as you said, it's a bit more likely that you can do those other mitigation steps, right? It's all about so does it carry risk? Yes, a dinner of 6, probably if people not within your household carries a certain amount of risk, but you can mitigate those risks with a couple of steps, as you mentioned, getting tested, and I would say even a couple of times if you have vulnerable people around you, because what we know is that for many of these tests, they're not as accurate in patients who are asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic, right? We know this from the White House experience, and then quarantining or sort of, just staying away from other contacts for a bit of time before you go to the dinner, that reduces the risk of this. The biggest risk is really those larger gatherings. It's really through, nowhere is it more perfectly embodied than the Trump rallies, where you see thousands of people in one place crammed together without masks yelling. And then there's a concern that I think there were cases in which, states have now looked at clusters of cases that have come out of those rallies.
Yeah.
And what kind of example does that set? When we give up, when people are sacrificing their Thanksgiving dinners, when people are sacrificing having funerals for their loved ones, when they're sacrificing giving up getting married this year, what kind of lesson is it to then have the person who leads us not sacrifice at all and have these types of rallies, these large rallies, that are potentially propagating the cases?
Yeah, but I mean, those are outrageous and they're flamboyantly right in our faces. Yeah. But I keep thinking about these holidays during the same winter, colder period that you're describing as a period of danger, when pandemic fatigue, we can feel it. It's already behind this rise in numbers in no small part. And it won't be mass rallies, but it'll be, if you have many, many gatherings of 6 or 10 or 12,
it can carry that risk. And that's why the safest thing is just to have a small dinner this year with just people within your household.
Yeah, yeah. But you know,
that's not going to happen. Yeah.
People are going to bust out. They're going to bust out of that. I mean, maybe we'll, you know, here I'm planning for 6 at the moment, provisionally. Maybe we'll back off of that and say we can't do it. Maybe we'll be having Zoom Thanksgiving. But, you know, we've already done a lot of Zoom meals and martinis, quarantinis, and I'm kind of tired of that.
Well, so aside the other things that you talked about, which of course is much more impossible to do in Massachusetts, is other ways to make those very small gatherings safer is to have them outdoors, at least the places where they can do that in November. Yeah, and within households, I think it's to, if you can, stand the weather, to leave the windows open, you know, and that helps some of the ventilation. Aside from the, in addition to the testing, in addition to the pre-quarantining, those are some of the things that could make smaller groups safer. But again, all of them carry that risk, and it's really the safest thing is, of course, within your community, having a dinner within your household.
What did you see in the Ebola crisis? And you were in the thick of this. What did you see in Africa about how this played out over time? How it changed societies? I mean, we still may see mass closures of businesses, restaurants, and other things, and performance centers that have been really central to the way we understand our social lives, our civic lives. What did you see in Africa about how societies were changed over time? Were there really significant changes? Did people give up, or did they, as things became more effective, did normalcy return, or were they different on the other side of Ebola, let's say?
Yeah, I'll just give 2 caveats before I speak about that. One is that, you know, Ebola is a different disease than COVID. And Ebola, it's that bloodborne, really. You have to be in close contact. You have to sort of really lay hands on someone and take care of them to be able to get that disease. And not only that, but I think you're talking about the West African countries that were affected, or even the most recent Ebola, outbreak that happened in Democratic Republic of Congo, in Ituri and North Kivu. Those are areas that have had underlying traumatic injuries to their society for a few different reasons. In West Africa, Liberia and Sierra Leone in particular had really bloody civil wars, 10 years before the Ebola epidemic occurred. And so there was this distrust against the government, right? That sort of led with that. And there had been momentary success and increases in educational sort of endeavors, and before that instability of the war that brought everything sort of crashing down again. And the countries were just about to start rebuilding when Ebola happened. And so the impact of this was, it brought back, I think for many folks that I spoke to, it brought back the trauma that was part of all of that war, right? And so it was
trauma.
Yeah, and what but in general, the common things that you saw where the pandemic fatigue is a real thing, and it over time sets up, and people let their guard down, and we have to continuously work against that. And the other thing that I noticed is that in every pandemic, and I think we may have talked about this last time, in every outbreak that I've been part of, these pathogens, they get us at our fault lines. They take advantage of the people that we leave out in the cold, and so if we have inequity in our healthcare system, well, guess who's going to get affected, with higher percentages. And so they're a mirror back to us in some ways, because they reflect back the priorities
where our weaknesses are.
Where our weaknesses are, where our priorities are, and not. The thing that might be educational in this is that, at least in, not so much with Ebola, but in 2015, I was one of the instructors for a course by Taiwanese CDC. So I was out in Taiwan with attendees from all these different Pacific Rim countries. And, talking to all these public health experts who had gone through SARS, the first SARS in 2001, 2002.
They got it bad out there.
They had it bad. And so they talked about the cultural impact of SARS, this population memory that occurred, after SARS. There was institutional memory, because it sort of did help build, get investment to build more infrastructure, more timely surveillance to pick these things up. But then at the population level, it left this memory of the importance of, public health mitigation measures. part of what was so hard in West Africa, was that people had never encountered, the general population of West Africa had never encountered Ebola virus disease. That was the first time Ebola had sort of affected that part of the world. And so there was sort of just confusion about why someone looked like they had malaria, because that's what Ebola looks like for the most part. And they were being taken into this white tarp tents, and 70% of the time they weren't coming out, right? So, and you're sort of, and it's a different scenario, but here you're sort of seeing how lucky this country has been in terms of being spared the impacts of prior epidemics, large epidemics like that. And our population hasn't yet understood or grasped the importance of these public health measures, these tools, which have tried and true been used in so many other epidemics. And what I hope, a positive thing that I hope happens, and I'll tell you about the negatives in a second. Positive thing that I hope happens is that this becomes ingrained, because Tom, believe me, in our lifespan, there will be another epidemic. There will be another pandemic before, and you and I will be here again. Unfortunately, I think probably within the next couple of decades.
I worry that we don't have, never mind physical immunity, because we haven't had it, as you say, we don't have cultural immunity. What I see playing out is this notion of American exceptionalism, which is a psychological, it's a state of mind. There's been some truth in it, because we had this isolated continent full of abundant resources, but I look at the way Americans are responding to this, many of them, and it's almost like, the hell with this, we're Americans. We don't have problems like this. We don't get overrun by disease like this. Doesn't happen here, and I'm not going to act like it will. It's almost a denial, a refusal, a sense of that, I'm invulnerable because I'm American. I shouldn't have to deal with this, and so I won't. And it'll work out because it has in the past. I mean, that is a kind of vulnerability. That's a lack of immunity that's cultural, not biological.
Yeah, that's really insightful, and I think that it probably is playing some role, and unfortunately it's then being stoked by, the powers at the highest.
Trump says, you're right, we're special, this is crazy.
We don't need to worry about this.
We don't have to take this crap, we're Americans.
So the other things that you see play out is, unfortunately, economic inequality usually gets worse. IMF had a report in the setting of most outbreaks and large epidemics. At the end of it, what you see is there's a factor called the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality in a country, and that usually gets worse. And you can see that because what's happening currently is poor people are losing their jobs, and people who are economically disadvantaged are generally the people in front lines for many of these jobs that require interface with the public. They potentially have not been getting the same types of protection. We saw that during the spring of the impact of this on essential workers. And then they end up in the hospital, and they may not have financial security when it comes to being stuck with large hospital bills. So they're sort of being affected from every quarter, as you can imagine. And so it's a cycle that almost feeds into itself. This is why you see that the disease poverty trap is something that you see in resource limited countries all the time, of how people cannot get out into financial security because they're being affected by infectious diseases, and
so if you don't get on top of it, you could actually be more vulnerable the next time, because if you fail, it's going to exacerbate the kinds of social problems and inequalities that leave veins of vulnerability wide open through the whole society.
And that's why we are, and this is where, we potentially could have had an advantage. We could have, and we did that with the first COVID relief bill. We tried to sort of fulfill some of those gaps. And I cannot believe that because of the arguments in our government, because of the inaction of this administration, we haven't been able to pass a COVID relief package. Another one, the second one. It's been months. Real people have an impact, they're suffering, and we haven't been able to do that. And that's what keeps people from going into that poverty disease trap. Because we're a rich country, we're a relatively rich country, and we're fortunate enough potentially to be able to carry people through this so that they're not affected this way. And we haven't been able to do that because of lack of political will.
The rest of the world looking at us and saying, you have all the resources just piled to the sky and you can't get on top of this. It doesn't speak very well of the American community's ability to take care of itself. Talk about long COVID. This phrase is getting more attention lately. This is, I guess, there's the acute phase that you recover from or you don't. But what's long COVID and what's its significance, Dr. Bhadelia?
So Tom, what we now know is that there's a percentage of people, huge host of people. So 87% of people, even with mild disease, CDC had a study that said up to 3 weeks after they were having symptoms, persistent symptoms. And hospitalized patients seem to have even more symptoms because they're not only have this disease, but being in the hospital or having lung issues that require mechanical ventilation, all those things carry the burden. But there is a smaller percentage that months out, and we, I think there are some estimates of about 10%. I think it's probably going to end up being much larger than that. I'm currently a principal investigator in a study looking at exactly this. And every time I have patients come in or participants come in who are survivors, months later, they're still talking about the impact that this has had on them.
What kind of impacts, Naeed? What kind?
Well, there's a great catalog of sort of patient stories and patient experiences on COVID. There's a patient-led sort of research collaboration out there around long COVID, and you see everything from just brain fogs, lack of shortness of breath, a persistent cough, issues with taste and smell. Just feeling run down all the time, feeling like your heart's always racing. So many symptoms that are sort of continuing. And so they themselves are adding to people's inability to sort of get back to work, get back to normal life.
Makes me want to cough.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is that, we've seen this in other emerging infectious diseases. In January 2015, I was doing a training for Ebola survivors in West Africa, my third trip out to Sierra Leone. And I think almost 50% of the people in that room with me who were getting trained again, we're talking about the fact that they had persistent symptoms. And of course, what we discovered during that epidemic was that people who survive Ebola have this thing called post-Ebola virus disease syndrome, where, and this has always happened, when people thought maybe virus had changed during West Africa, but when they went back and looked at other Ebola outbreaks, the other survivors said the same thing. The difference is, we hadn't been around long enough in prior epidemics to sort of define that, and the healthcare systems in some of the places where the outbreaks occurred didn't have the capacity to sort of capture this longitudinal experience that people are having, right? So what we're seeing is something similar, a new virus that might have new types of, disease manifestations that we don't yet completely understand. And it wouldn't surprise me if some of long COVID is not just someone recovering from hospitalizations, but what it appears now to be is the direct impact of this virus on the human body.
So, but this goes back to the cultural and political. It's not enough to say, hey, you can get this and get over it and we'll move on. Move on, America. We don't need to be struggling with this or stuck on this. But if you've got 65,000 new cases yesterday, that's one day. If some significant portion of those, that's many thousands of people who could have long COVID consequences of this, years of their life, maybe the rest of their lives, I don't know, where they're struggling with the leftover effect of this thing.
Right. And of course, we don't know how long it lasts, right? I mean, hopefully it is something that's more, for most people, it's something that's more medium term and doesn't follow them into the long term. But we don't know because we have not lived through it. That's the interesting thing about many of these emerging infectious diseases is that you learn about them as you live through the response of them. The first 100 patients teach you about the care of the next 100 patients. You learn about the disease, the science changes. And when the science changes, the public health policy has to change. And what you see is that there's just confusion among the public about why that's happening. How did the scientists not know this? But of course, the basis of this is when there's a new virus, we're learning as we're responding to it.
Let's go out on the vaccine. It's a big subject, but Pfizer's talking about potentially having something moving into the next stage next month, middle of November. On the other hand, we saw Johnson & Johnson and somebody else. Did they take a pause because somebody in their trials got sick? Where are we in this? How soon do you think we could have something that's effective? And then once we do, then what?
Yeah, so currently there's 4 vaccines in the U.S. that are in these advanced clinical trials, and as you said, Johnson & Johnson has had a pause because there was a potential adverse effect, but it's unclear if it was in a person who got a placebo or a person who got the vaccine. So this is very normal. This happens pretty often in clinical trials where there's a stop and there's an examination of whether any event could have been related to the trial itself. And if it was related to trial, there's an independent data safety monitoring board that looks at it and makes a determination of whether it could be related to the vaccine. And that's what's happening with Johnson & Johnson. As you said, I think the optimistic view is that by end of November, beginning of December, we'll have potential data on efficacy, or how well these vaccines work in preventing disease. And then if that's the case, there's already investment in trying to get, at least the first 20, 30 million doses that would be out by end of December, beginning of January, but those would be distributed to healthcare workers and those in the very high risk groups, such as nursing home sort of residents and others. And then
so they're ready to turn around. They're ready to turn around 20 or 30 million doses within a month or two. So
yeah,
there's big factories standing by.
Exactly. There's an operation. That's part of the advantage of having this Operation Warp Speed. We'll see how that's the plan. We'll see how successfully it plays out, right? Because it requires, there's a lot of thinking in terms of not just this manufacturing, which has been invested in, but also the allocation now and distribution of it, and eventually administration to patients. And so by spring or so, you might see a second phase of more doses available for more high-risk patients, more essential workers. And some parts of general public, and then for most general public, it would be, from what Dr. Redfield has said, would be next summer, or potentially fall. So that's sort of an optimistic perspective of what might happen.
Let's take that scenario.
Yeah.
What percentage of the population do you need to have vaccinated before the spread starts to really be affected, starts to be dragged down?
Yeah, so this very much depends on how effective the vaccine is. So a vaccine that, gives you 60, 70% efficacy or 50% efficacy, I think is what they're hoping for, the FDA is hoping for. You need at least 65 to 70% people vaccinated. So the lower the effectiveness of the vaccine, the more people need to be vaccinated, right? So that's how usually it goes. So that's why you need to sort of get to, we have to wait and see is the short answer of what the efficacy data tells us from these trials to sort of then determine how many people would need to get vaccinated for us to reach that herd immunity.
But let's say it's 65
vaccine-induced herd immunity.
Yes, vaccine-induced. Let's say it's 65 to 70%. Again, let's be optimistic and say that's not too bad, I guess, for a vaccine. But it seems to me that means we'll still have to mask up and social distance, because that leaves 30 or 35% vulnerability, even if you're vaccinated, until the presence of it in society dramatically diminishes. Well, we can't go back to normal life even with the vaccine then, can we? Or what's it mean?
So it's hard, it's complicated for the last minute of the show, but I think what the thought is that, over time, we're hoping that the vaccine-induced immunity actually lasts longer, right? And so, and not only that, but even if you get reinfected, if you've had the vaccine, that the severity is low. And so the thought would be that over time, and of course, nobody knows how long that period of time is, that once you've had it, maybe the subsequent time that you get the disease, it's milder. And so this disease, coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, doesn't disappear. Most likely what happens is we suppress it down, it comes back in the winter months, and it has some impact. It doesn't go down to zero, but the impact that it has is not what it's doing right now. It's not like ravaging the entire population, because all of us are vulnerable. That's really the goal. And so we may go back to normal, hopefully sooner than few years, but again, we won't know until we see how effective the vaccine is, how long that immunity lasts, how many people take the vaccine.
My takeaway is it's a long road still, even if in the optimistic scenario, that the danger is nihilism. If we fall prey to that and we just kind of throw up our hands and give up, we could have a real nightmare scenario here, kind of real dystopian scenario. That even if there's a change of administrations, listening to you today, we've got a long road after November 3rd, but a different tone from the top could make a big difference, particularly when it comes to this nihilism, which in a way lies behind a lot of what we've heard from, I fear, from President Trump. Wow. It ain't easy, even on the best scenario.
Yeah.
You've been there in the heart of Africa working on Ebola, and now we're really glad that you're so active in thinking and researching and leading on the coronavirus front. And we're very grateful to you, Dr. Nahid Bhadelia, for your insights today. And we wish you well. Stay on it. Keep your spirits up. We need people who are out there on the point of the spear to be to feel the support of many, many people behind you. You know, keep your high beams on, figure it out with us and for us. And let's do this just as well as it can possibly done. Not like so far.
Thank you so much for the support, and thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Good luck. Go get it. We need you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks everybody for listening. It's great to have you with us. That is a very informative piece of conversation right there. I hope certainly has been for me. It's great to be with you. Talk to you soon.